everyone, this is the second part of the third session. I'm going to talk about some small topics very quickly. The first one is Sampa and Xampa. Sampa is an alphabet which is used to transcribe the phonetics and phonology of languages, of certain languages, but it's different from IPA in that it is made machine readable. It was very common in the 80s and 90s, now not so much. And there is an extended version, which is the Xampa, which covers the whole of IPA. The main languages are Danish, English, French, German, Italian, and Dutch, but over the years all the languages have been included, and now with Xampa you could transcribe basically any language. It is not an independent alphabet and encodes IPA for computational analysis. This is an example of Xampa. You see all the consonants in IPA are covered, and it basically uses Latin letters, numbers, and some additional symbols to encode the IPA. It's mostly relatively intuitive, but sometimes you have additional symbols which are less intuitive, like backslashes, and for vowels you also use numbers. For example, here you can use an add symbol and numbers and some additional symbols to encode vowels. We won't be using Sampa. You also have the diacritics. It's very unintuitive, but you can use it to transcribe English and other languages quite well. It was very much liked by computational linguists because it was easier to work with it in the computer than IPA was, especially before the advent of very nice Unicode, which we have now. So it's important that you know that it exists and what it is, because there are still many resources like the Selex database and others that still use Sampa for transcription. Newer resources are usually used with using Unicode and IPA Unicode, but other ones you still see this. And if you're interested, you should check out these links to see how you can convert, how you can transcribe English or German using Sampa. Okay, now to some more linguistic topics. The first one is pitch. This is quite important, and pitch is a property of sound, and it has to do with the frequency of the waves, and it allows us to play sound and on ranges, on pitch ranges from very low to high, and this is most prominent in vowels and glides. So pitch is produced by the tenses of the vocal folds, and the more tense they are, the harder the pitch, and the less tense, the lower the pitch. And there are two types of pitch effects in language. One is tone and the other one is intonation. Tone is about the pitch on individual words, and tonal languages are languages which distinguish words based on their pitch. The most famous example is Mandarin, but there are others. So here are some examples from Mandarin. 4 different words with ma, and depending on the tone, they change the meaning. So from mother, hemmed, horse, and scold. You can hear it.
Ma, 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 ma.
But there are other languages. Here's, for example, Cantonese.
Si, 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 si.
And they are all different. And here's Thai.
Ka, 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 ka.
Na, 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 na.
Right? So you probably associate tone and tonal languages with Asia. But this is a slight misconception. While there are quite a few tonal languages in Asia, the most tonal languages are in Central America and in Africa, mostly. And the tonal systems of Africa are the most common ones. They are quite different from Mandarin. We might come to that at some point. For now, it's just worth noting. So Africa really is the hotspot for tonal languages in the world. Now, okay, that's tone. In English, in contrast, if I say car or car, there is no difference in meaning. It doesn't matter. We can mark tone using IPA. These are the symbols from extra high to extra low, and for contour tones. So the difference between level tones and contour tones is that a level tone doesn't change throughout the realization of the vowel, and a contour tone does. So let's go back. Yes. So, for example, this is a high tone.
ka,
It stays the same. It's a level tone. And this is a contour tone. This is rising.
ka,
It changes. It goes from lower to higher. And you can have more complex contour tones. For example, from low falling raising, right?
Nah.
It falls and then goes back up. Okay. And intonation is about pitch changes in the whole utterance and not just a word, and they do change the meaning of the utterance. So the most familiar example to us is the intonation difference between statements and questions. So for a statement, the intonation goes down, this is my car, or stays flat. And for question, at least in English, the intonation goes up. Are you hungry? So there's a pitch change throughout the utterance, and it changes the meaning of the utterance. Another relatively well-known phonation type of phenomenon is stress. Stress is very hard to define, and phonetically it combines pitch, loudness, and length, and different languages do stress with different cues. So there are still debates about which languages use which cues, but roughly speaking, pitch, loudness, and length are the main cues of stress. And there are many examples of stress being contrastive in different languages. In German, it mostly isn't. In English, it can be contrastive, so you can have two different words which contrast only in stress. In Spanish, it's even more pronounced. For example, you can hear the difference between canto and canto, and those two are two different cells in the paradigm of cantar, which is to sing. And the main idea is that it makes one syllable be more prominent than the other syllables in a word. There are two types of stress. You have primary stress and secondary stress, and primary stress is the most prominent syllable. Secondary stress marks syllables which are a little bit more prominent but less prominent than the most prominent one. There are two diacritics to mark stress. These diacritic here on top marks primary stress, and the diacritic here on the bottom marks secondary stress. Okay, these are the subproximentals in IPA. add the stress marks. So, for example, here phonation, you have the primary stress mark on the theme and the secondary stress mark in the foe. You have other diacritics, things like length, half length, extra short vowels. You can mark syllable breaks and also links between the syllables to mark there is no break. And as I just showed you, you mark stress directly on the syllable, directly before the vowel that it's going to be stressed. So an important point is that in real speech, single segments do not exist in isolation. They are pronounced in a context, in a phonetic context, and the fact that things are articulated in a context means that certain sounds, or that the context affects the sound, the phonation of individual sounds. And because of this, we have processes or phonetic processes which affect the actual realization of the individual phonemes in a language. So you have processes which change the nature of the segments. This makes things either easier to articulate or words to be more distinct, and speech to make to be more efficient when we speak. There are different types of processes. Here's an example of nasalization and reduction. When you have the word bank, you can reduce the nasal consonant. This becomes shorter and the vowel becomes nasalized, and let's see how it happens. This is another example. I'll come back to this in a second. Here's an example of reduction. The word parade in English, so parade, can be reduced to parade, and this is because you basically can anticipate the production of the r in English. Here I'm using this incorrect symbol, but it's a r in English. You can drop the schwa, which is unstressed and very short, and you can join together the p and the r, and because they are together, the r becomes devoiced. Recall that this is the devoicing symbol. So the word becomes shorter, and there is a co-articulation between p and r, so that the voicing becomes homogeneous between both, and this makes the word easier to articulate. This is a kind of anticipatory effect. So you start with a voiceless consonant and you carry on this voicelessness throughout. The sort of opposite is lengthening. This happens in English sometimes in certain contexts. For example, when you're trying to be more clear, when you want to make yourself understand better. So in a conversation like, it's red, did you say it's red? No, I said it's Fred. You lengthen and emphasize the sound to make it clear that you're not talking about red, but about Fred. It requires more effort, but it makes perception easier. Insertion happens also to make things more perceptible. Same sort of situation, stop screaming, and the other person doesn't quite understand, and stop screaming. And in that context, you can say, no, stop screaming. So there is an insertion of a schwa to make the word more contrastive with the confused word. It becomes more understandable what you're saying. A different sort of phenomenon is assimilation, An assimilation is how one segment influences the realization of a different segment. And this results in both segments becoming more similar to each other. There are two types of assimilation. One is regressive. For example, this is when a sound influences the preceding sound. For example, a consonant can influence the preceding vowel. A nasal consonant can make the vowel before it becomes nasal itself, because the volume becomes already lowered when you're pronouncing the vowel before you've even started pronouncing the consonant. Progressive assimilation is the opposite. A consonant or a sound influences the following sound. So a consonant can influence a vowel. A nasalized pronunciation can be, for example, that you start with a nasal and the volume keeps on going, keeps on being lowered. It doesn't raise immediately, so there is some nasalization of the following vowel. This is another example of assimilation. This is you can have the voicing of the following consonant. You can also have the opposite voicing of the following or preceding consonant. You can have assimilation of the place of articulation. So, for example, in English, it's a derivational prefix, which means the opposite of, more or less. But it depending on the context of the initial phoneme of the word, it will be either bilabial, im, or labiodental, in. And this depends on whether the first consonant of the word that it's attaching to is bilabial or labiodental. So this is a place of articulation assimilation. And assimilation is the opposite situation, where two sounds become more distinct to make them more perceivable, more easy to distinguish and to perceive. An example is sex in German, which used to be pronounced as sex, but this was harder to perceive, so the two sounds became more dissimilar, and that made them easier to distinguish. Then we have deletion. This is when we just drop certain sounds. This happens in fast speech. I just gave you an example of parade. Suppose is a different example. So you can drop the schwa at the beginning from suppose to suppose. Nepenthes is the opposite. You insert segments, and you can insert either vowels or consonants. Here are some examples of consonant epentheses, where you, in something which is something, you can insert a P, something. And here are some additional examples of P insertions. And that's basically it for this first session. I will upload the remaining, the other video for the next session later today. Thank you.